What is going on, everybody? Today is a very special episode of Rankings. Yes, I am bringing back the Rankings series. Who would have thought of that? Today, we're doing a very simple episode where we will be ranking every single Resident Evil video or game. Yeah, every Resident Evil game. Yeah. So, um, the whoever made this tier maker list literally added every single Resident Evil game. So this should indeed be fun. So starting off strong, we got the very first Resident Evil game. For those of you who don't know the Resident Evil franchise, Resident Evil is pretty much one of, if not the most iconic horror game franchise that isn't like Silent Hill or something. And so today, we are starting off with the very first Resident Evil game. And right off the bat, Resident Evil 1 is A tier. It's not the greatest in the series. I will admit Resident Evil 2 and 3 are 10 times better than the first Resident Evil game. But I will admit that Resident Evil 1 does have a lot of strong suits. I first played the first Resident Evil game with the Resident Evil 1 remake for the Nintendo GameCube. And so I think the first Resident Evil game is a good game, but I will admit it is one of the most difficult games to go back to nowadays. So I'm just going to put it in A tier for simplicity purposes. Now, I will actually be adding um, a brand new list, simply titled Have Not Played because of Resident Evil Director's Cut. I heard it's a really good game, but I have not played Resident Evil Director's Cut. I've always wanted to. And I've heard a lot of good things about it, but due to my inexperience with Resident Evil Director's Cut, I will just put it in the have not played section. Now, going on to Resident Evil 2, on the other hand, um, going to the S tier. The very first appearances of Claire and Leon. Leon is fucking the most recognizable character in all of Resident Evil now. And just considering the fact that this is basically just the first game where he appears and he's just like your average Joe of a cop, and basically by the time Resident Evil 4 comes around, they make him into a fucking complete badass. And so I find Resident Evil 2, especially the N64 version, I will point this version out. I believe that was, if not one of the first versions of the game that I played. I didn't actually play Resident Evil 2 until much later on. I did play Resident Evil 3 though on GameCube, but Resident Evil 2 I played much later on. I discovered the N64 version. Such an impressive port. Kudos to Capcom for making that happen. But from what I've played, Resident Evil 2 is a very good game, and so is its sequel, Resident Evil 3. We got for no the second appearance of Jill Valentine. They made her into, like I said, a complete badass, and I actually don't know if this takes place after Resident Evil 2, during Resident Evil 2. I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention to the story, but Resident Evil 3 is such a good game. And yes, like I said previously, I have played Resident Evil 3, and it is, like I said, a masterpiece. Resident Evil Survivor, on the other hand, not so much. And okay, I'll get this out of the way now. Resident Evil Survivor was a mainly a first person game. I don't know if I'm remembering correctly, but it was a third person slash first person game, and it was the first FPS version of this game. Um, Up until I believe the Umbrella Chronicles might be, yeah, that was one of the first ones, but Resident Evil Survivor, from what I've played, just isn't a good game. I've played it; it's decent, but it's just not good. I'm also gonna group these next two together for Code Veronica and Code Veronica X. I'll put Code Veronica X in S tier and regular Code Veronica in A tier. From what I've played, Code Veronica X is in fact a really, really good entry in the series. It was one of the first PS2 games I played, if I'm not mistaken. And it was such a solid game. I'm not going to go into great detail as to why it's such a good game, but I assure you, Code Veronica X is one of the best Resident Evil games that I have played. Getting into the next one, Resident Evil Survivor 2. Just haven't played it. Um, and I'm gonna be going through these next couple very quickly, like Resident Evil Gaiden, C tier, not great, but it's also not terrible. Resident Evil 1 remake, I will put in S tier as well because I first played Resident Evil 1 because of its remake. And it is such a solid game. And I will also be noting that all of the remasters and remakes will most likely be going into S tier. Resident Evil Zero, I'm putting in A tier. Decent, pretty solid game. I would actually rate this particular entry solid like 8 out of 10. Resident Evil Zero is a solid entry nonetheless, and so is Resident Evil Dead Aim. I will admit that Dead Aim is quite the departure from the franchise, but pretty solid game nonetheless. Resident Evil Outbreak is also an S tier. This was one of the first Resident Evil games I played on PS2. I actually still have the game on PS2 somewhere, and it's just a freaking awesome game. However, I will admit that Outbreak File Number 2 is a semi step back from the franchise, although I will say that it is a good game nonetheless. Moving on to Resident Evil 4, I would also be putting in very high S tier because this was, if not the first major Resident Evil game that I ever got into. I had played, like I said, Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 3 before, but I wasn't exactly the greatest at those games because I was like 6 to 7 years old. Well, Resident Evil 4, on the other hand, was the very first entry that I played on GameCube. I was a big GameCube head, still am, and Resident Evil 4 was actually the first Resident Evil game that I ever beat from start to finish, and it is, if not my favorite Resident Evil game. Um, which I will actually put the Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles up in B tier. Solid titles, not the greatest. They are Wii games I have gotten behind. I will rate Dark Side Chronicles a little bit higher. And I haven't actually really given it much thought. Actually, I'll put Survivor a little bit lower, but Dark Side Chronicles, I really enjoyed that. It actually, between the two, is my favorite of the Resident Evil games on Wii. Um, I love the Resident Evil 4 uh Wii variant. Fucking awesome title. Highly recommend um all of you guys to play it. It is Dark Side Chronicles and Umbrella Chronicles are top tier games in my opinion. Like I said, I will put this as a note out to all the people who will be angry in the comments. These are my personal opinions. From what I have played, all of these games are currently not changing. I will admit the Dark Side Chronicles, from at least aesthetic purposes, I'm mainly doing this off of gameplay, story, and aesthetic. And the Dark Side Chronicles, in my opinion, just looks better and it plays decently well. Which leads me to Resident Evil 5, the very first game to be in that sort of, it was another one of the tank shooter or the tank control games. And Resident Evil 5, I will say, is definitely a solid B tier. Not the greatest game in the world, but it is enjoyable to the point where I haven't replayed Resident Evil 5, and it's definitely a cool game to play with a friend. But not really a game that I would say is worth replaying to the extent that I did. I was mainly an achievement hunter back in the day, but anyway, not my point. So Resident Evil 5, solid title, but I will put it into the middle ground of games. And oh yeah, Resident Evil Guidance also going on there too. Yeah, from what I've experienced, these two aren't great, and I will be saving the C tier for another um, entry, which I will get to later on. Which brings me to Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D, which is our very first C tier, because although I will admit, uh, Mercenaries is one of my favorite game modes in really all of the Resident Evil games, but making a game out of it just that was also just kind of iffy. And it was also a 3DS game, so there's that. But yeah, it's a solid game. Not great, but not terrible. Mid nonetheless. I will, however, be putting Resident Evil Revelations in B because, like I said, I love the Revelation series, and it really sucks that we never got a Revelations 3. But just to move this by a little bit faster, I'll also be putting Operation Raccoon City down there. It was an okay game. Not exactly saying it's great. I'm not saying it's terrible. I actually have the PC version stored somewhere on my computer, and it is a pretty solid title. But it's a game that I sort of pick up every now and again, and it's like, oh, this is fun. Not really a game I would recommend to diehard fans, but if you're getting new into the series and you're a fan of third person shooters and not exactly really too big into the action side of Resident Evil and the horror elements of the game, then I would recommend Operation Raccoon City. But other than that, not really. Which leads me to Resident Evil 6, which I'll also be putting in F tier. I know Resident Evil 6 is one of the worst games in the series. I am saying that from personal experience. I didn't really like the game because it was very repetitive and a lot of characters became very unlikable. And it was basically the point in the series where Capcom was just running out of ideas and giving up and making Leon a goth. I would say in Resident Evil 6 in particular, they made him like a goth guy. They basically turned him from the newbie to the pro to the Batman type deal. They made him a very dark character in this game, at least aesthetic wise, and I just don't like Resident Evil 6. I liked Resident Evil 6 when I was playing with a buddy of mine who I actually met because I was playing Resident Evil 6. But if you're playing it by yourself, I wouldn't really recommend it. Which actually leads me to um Resident Evil Revelations 2, which is one of my favorite Resident Evil games. Solid title, great return for Claire, and the introduction of Moira. Um, and just the freaking reintroduction of fucking Barry from the first game was also a great addition, and just sort of moving along the lore and timeline of the series. I think Resident Evil Revelations 2 is a solid title. The PS Vita version, not so much. Let's see how much. 14 minutes. All right, solid. Um, which leaves me to the next title, Umbrella Corps. Is also an F tier. I didn't like it. I thought I would enjoy it, but it wasn't for me. Uh, it's not really a good title. And it's the fact that Umbrella Corps is even considered a Resident Evil game just fucking sickens me. Which leaves me, or leads into the next two S tiers, which is Resident Evil 7 and the Lost Footage. Actually, I'll put Lost Footage into A tier because I think even though Lost Footage was a definitely a good addition to Resident Evil 7, I think Resident Evil 7 just in and of itself is just a fucking god tier game because fucking Resident Evil 7 turned into a return to the franchise because, like I said, at this particular point in time, the Resident Evil series was struggling because Resident Evil 4 was good, Resident Evil 5 was mid, and then Resident Evil 6 was just outright terrible. Which then they released Resident Evil Revelations 2, which I thought was a solid title, but Resident Evil 7 was a reintroduction to the series, and it is the first FPS game to sort of recapture capitalize that FPS sort of aesthetic that a game like Survivor, the Chronicles games were sort of reintroducing. Which leads me into the next game, Resident Evil 2. Solid title. Uh and it's just a really good remake. I like Resident Evil 2, and I sure as hell like Resident Evil 7. This was at a point in time where Capcom was just like, you know what? Let's give the fans what they want. Because a lot of people were wondering, well, if Resident Evil 7 is going to be next, what about the remakes of certain games? Because at this particular point in time, we hadn't really had a major remake that wasn't like Code Veronica X or something like that. And basically, the fact that Resident Evil 7 was pure survival horror and not just mowing down enemies for 10 hours straight is a fucking definitely a great step up. And the fact that Resident Evil 2, like, I will actually rank these a little bit higher because I think that, uh, yeah, I think the Resident Evil 2 remake is, if not one of my favorite remakes. And to this very day, it is a game that I constantly go back to, and I highly recommend for those of you who haven't played it yet to go play it. And Resident Evil 3, I think it's just a middle ground for the Resident Evil series. It was okay. I liked it. It was the first remake that I played in the series, but fucking, it's not as good as Resident Evil 2. I'll say it's decent, but not the greatest. Which Resident Evil Resistance I am going to be putting down in the have not played section because personally speaking, have no experience with Resistance. I think I played it like once, but I wouldn't exactly say that's enough experience to warrant me having a whole segment of this video be dedicated to it exactly. Um, Resident Evil Village, also a pretty solid title. Not as good as Resident Evil 7, but I will say that it really saddened. It made me pretty sad when they killed off Ethan in Resident Evil Village because it was like at the time like the short one of the shortest character arcs in all of the Resident Evil franchise. Basically, they had him in a game, then they didn't have him in a game because they killed him off a game after the game right after he had just appeared, and it was like I said, Resident Evil Village is such a solid title, but um, Shadows of Rose, on the other hand, is even better. I like Village, but Shadows of Rose is definitely a really solid title, and it's definitely worth the money that I spent on it. And Village just in and of itself, all of its DLC, the game itself is just a fucking beautiful game. But I will, okay, actually, I'll rate this just under Resident Evil Village. I'll put these ones lower as well. Yeah, I think Village and Shadows of Rose just coupled together it's just a really solid uh set. And if you buy the gold version, you get both of those things. And I think coupled together, it's pretty solid. Which leads me to the final two of this video. Resident Evil 4 and uh Separate Ways. Huh. I haven't played Separate Ways, and I actually have played Resident Evil 4 Remake, and I'll also be putting it in A tier. It's not as good as Resident Evil 2, but it is a lot better than Resident Evil 3. And Resident Evil 4, from what I've played, is a very solid upgrade to Resident Evil 3. I thought Resident Evil 3 basically was just a faster paced game with a lot less character and a lot less story than Resident Evil 2 was. And I just think Resident Evil 3 was just a middle ground of what the remakes have at least now have shown. But I do think Resident Evil 4 is a very solid upgrade, and the fact that the voice actor for Leon returned and we get introduced Ada again, which sort of foretells what we may or may not see from the future of the games. I've heard that Code Veronica might be getting a remake, and I hear that they might even be remaking Resident Evil 5. Or hell, if they remake Resident Evil 6, I might change my mind for it being the worst game in the series. Um, but I've played Resident Evil 4, but I haven't played Separate Ways. Like I said, I have heard that Separate Ways is a very good DLC. I've heard a lot of positive stuff about the game nonetheless. And I just think that it is, as it stands, a pretty good tier list. I like most of these games. I fucking love Outbreak. I sure as hell love Resident Evil 4. And I think that this is pretty solid. This isn't exactly in a specific order. I only changed this just to, or just changed most of S tier to make it look a little bit prettier. But that's pretty much it. I am pretty satisfied with my rankings. And if you agree with any of them, if you disagree, please comment down below and let me know because your suggestions are what help this channel evolve. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you guys enjoy. This was a very fun tier list to make. I don't think I've up until this point in time have actually ranked all of these, and so I think this is a pretty good mainstay. Yeah, I would really like to continue making ranking videos for specifically like Call of Duty or the Silent Hill series. I might even do a Silent Hill video. Who knows? But I hope you all enjoy. This is Dovik signing off, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.